Hey guys, welcome back into our Python programming series. In this episode, we will go ahead and work with the exception handling. Exception is just simply an event which occurs during the execution of a program, and that will go and disrupt the normal flow of your program. So in general, when a Python script encounters a situation that it cannot handle really, it will raise an exception. And that exception is a Python object that is represented in the form of an error. So a lot of people, when they see an exception, they call it as an error. So which is also okay, but those are really an exception. So when an exception or when your script is running and it raises an exception, we must either handle that exception immediately. Otherwise, the script will get terminated or gets quit on that particular spot unless we are handling that particular exception or the error. So within the Python, to handle the exception or the error, basically right terminology is exception. So to handle an exception, we have something called the try and except block. We can make use of the try and except block within our script to handle any kind of exception. So let's directly jump onto the hands-on to really understand how do we really work with the exception handling, and how do we really make use of the try and the except block. So now let's go ahead and try doing something pretty funny here. So now we'll go ahead and say, hey, print a variable. Let's call the variable as x, or let's call the variable as my underscore string. So if you see in this program, what we went ahead and did on the first line, we are saying, okay, print my string. But if you noticed so far in this program, we have not declared this variable. I know in Python we don't have to specify the type of the variable, but at least if we are trying to use some variable, we need to declare that variable. In this case, we have not declared any variable. So let's see what happens. Now try to run this program. So run hello world. And as we ran this particular program, you can see Python immediately said, okay, hey, name error. Name my underscore string is not defined. It clearly says, okay, you are using some variable my underscore string which is not defined. And pay attention, it says the type of the exception here is name error. It says clearly because this my underscore string name is not defined, and that's the reason Python is throwing an exception, and the type of exception is a name error, which is clearly indicate that, okay, Python was not able to handle this particular situation. So because of that, it went ahead and raised an exception. So now how do we really handle these exceptions? As we said, we can make use of the try and except block to handle these exceptions. So if we have to handle this, we can try something like this. Okay, hey, I want to try something. So we can make use of a try. And I'm thinking when I'm going to try, probably I may run into some potential situation. So now we can go ahead and, hey, this is what I want to try. I think maybe there may be a possibility when I'm running this, my program may encounter some exception. So to handle that, we can put that code inside our try block basically. And try block is the one will potential has chances of generating some exceptions. Now, if that happens, what we can do, instead of terminating the program, we can tell the user, okay, we can make use of the except, and within the except, we can say, okay, hey, we put some message, print an exception occurred in the script. So now let's try to run this program. When we ran this program earlier, Python threw an exception of type name error where it clearly says the name that you are trying to refer, my string, is not defined. So now let's see what happens. Before I run, let me just go ahead and clear this one and now rerun this particular program, hello world. And see in this case what happened. Instead of Python throwing some built-in exception, we are being presented with a nice message. That message says, okay, hey, an exception occurred in the script. And why it occurred? Because we think this my string was not defined, now we know. But instead of Python throwing some built-in exception, we went ahead and handled that properly with the help of this try and except. So that's how you can make use of this try and except within your Python script. If you are writing large code and you think, hey, there is a potential chance some exception may occur, so it's better to write that code within the try block. And if some exception occur, I want to handle that in one way, maybe you can go ahead and put that in your except. So within a script, you can have one except that will catch everything, or you can have a name based except also. When I say name based, we can specify the type of a specific exception. If you recall the earlier exception that we had, that was a name error. So instead of doing a catch all for anything, we can say, okay, if you see a name exception, you do something else. If there is any other exception other than name, you print something else. So what I mean, let's say, now we know that we have not declared this my string. So that means the exception thrown for this was name error. Now, if the name error exception occurs, I want to handle in some way. So now I can go ahead and put another except block here. But with this except block, I can go ahead and specify the type of exception we want to handle. And when I'm typing, there are many exceptions that we can handle, like name error, not implemented, exception, stop iteration probably, base exception, asserted error. So in this case, we are interested in handling the name error. Hey, if the name error exception happens, what do we want to do? Simply go ahead and print a message that then say, we can go ahead and say, looks like above variable is not defined. Define the variable before using. Now let's go ahead and run this program. So before I run, let me go ahead and clear, because remember last time when we ran, the message was an exception occurred in the script. So now let's clear and rerun this and see what happens. So right click again and run. So this time we are being presented with a different message, and it says looks like above variable is not defined. Define the variable before using. Because the reason we know the variable myString that we are using is not defined, and when it's not defined, Python is throwing an exception of type name error, and we are handling that name error with the except block, and we are specifying the type as name error, and we went ahead and printed some message that we wanted this to handle. So that means within a script you can have multiple except block that we want to be really handled. There is another thing with the try and except block. We can also make use of the else keyword. So the else keyword to define a block of code to be executed if no errors were raised. Let's say if there is no error, that means I can just simply go ahead and say, okay, hey, that means no errors were really raised in my program. So for that, I can go ahead and add an else here. And within the else, I can say, okay, all went well. So to really have this to be executed, let me go ahead and define my underscore string is hello Python. Now let's go ahead and rerun this program. Let me just go ahead and clear the output, rerun this program, and then see what happens. So now we are being presented where it says, okay, hey, now the code, we went ahead and declared this variable. Now within the try block, our code was this time successful. So that's the reason we say hello Python. And there was no exception. So the except name error was not executed, except was not executed because there were no exception. But within the try and this whole except, we had an else block. So the else block got executed. So again, the else block code gets executed if there were no errors raised, or if there were no exception throughout this program basically, or throughout this script, or throughout within this try block. So if you want some message to be printed, that's how we can make use of the else keyword. There is another keyword with the try and except that we can make use of. It's called the finally. And as the name says, finally, this is the block of code, if specified, will be executed regardless if the try block raises an error or not. If there was no error, or if there was error, this block of code will always get executed. And to really see that, let's go ahead and change this maybe to finally, and I will say script completed. But we don't know really whether it was successful or not successful. But this finally block of code will get executed no matter if we had an error or not. So to demonstrate that, let's go ahead and rerun. So let me go ahead and clear this all. And now in this case, we know there are no errors because we have already defined this variable. Let's see what happens though. So run hello world. And as you can see, the print was printed and the finally says script completed. So that's fine. Now let's go ahead and clear this one, and let's go ahead and introduce the error back, or the exception back in our program, by undeclaring that variable. Now we know definitely in this program, in this script, we have an exception of type name error. Now let's go ahead and rerun this program one more time, run hello world. And as you can see, definitely there was an error within the try block, and that's the reason the except name error catch happened. And because of that, we went ahead and printed this message. But once everything was done, we also printed whatever was written in the finally block, and which is script completed. So something to keep in mind, You can go ahead and write certain code no matter if the your script passed or failed. You always want that to be executed. Yeah, definitely you can go ahead and write that particular stuff within finally. But do work with a different type of exception and see how can you really handle some of the exception. We'll try a couple more example in the next episode when we'll work with the our file handling, and that's one of the good place where you can go ahead and do some try and accept and probably finally. That'll be all for this episode. I will see you guys in the next episode. Thank you.